Oak. The Fraser River had been frozen solid for 11 days when Marguerite Calloway realized she was going to watch her daughter die in the dark. Oak. The canvas walls of their shelter, a prospector's surplus tent that had seen better decades, snapped and billowed in the brutal January wind rolling down from the coast mountains of British Columbia. Outside, the temperature had dropped past what the old-timers in Lillooet called killing cold. The kind that didn't just bite at exposed skin, but worked its way through wool and leather and bone until the body simply forgot how to stay warm. Oak. Inside, 6-year-old Rosalie lay curled on a bedroll of flour sacks and salvaged rabbit pelts, her breathing shallow, her small lips the color of a winter sky before snow. Oak. Marguerite pressed her palm to her daughter's forehead and felt the fever burning beneath the surface, dry and relentless as a brush fire. Rosalie had stopped shivering an hour ago. Marguerite knew enough to understand that was not a good sign. Oak. 8-year-old Owen sat near the tent's entrance, his back straight, his father's old fishing knife clutched in both hands across his knees. He hadn't moved from that post in 2 hours. He was watching the gap in the canvas the way a much older person watches a door they're not sure they want to open. Oak. "Mama," he said quietly, not turning around. "There's something moving in the cedars again." Oak. Marguerite didn't answer right away. She was calculating, the way she had been calculating every waking moment for the past 3 weeks. Wood against cold, food against hunger, miles against weather. The calculation kept coming up short on every count. Their firewood had been reduced to 4 damp pieces of split pine. The last of her dried moose jerky had been divided between the children 2 mornings ago. Oak. The river trail south to Lillooet was buried under 4 feet of wind-blown snow, and the blizzard that had pinned them to this outcropping of rock above the Fraser Canyon showed no sign of breaking before morning. Oak. She had been trying to get them to her sister's homestead in Lytton, 70 miles of the old Caribou Wagon Road. She had made it 43. Oak. The reason she had run at all sat like a stone in her chest, cold and immovable. Declan Marguerite had married him at 22, because he had steady hands and a promising timber lease, and because her father had approved. She had buried him at 26, or so the county record in Cache Creek claimed. The truth, which she had only discovered after his funeral, was that Declan had not simply died of a fever. Oak. He had been pushed, quietly, methodically, deliberately, out of his timber agreement by a man named Reginald Sutter, who ran the largest land consolidation operation between Kamloops and the coast. Sutter had filed a lien against Declan's lease the morning after he was buried, claiming a debt Marguerite had never heard of, presented in a ledger she had never seen, witnessed by a notary who took his meals every Tuesday at Sutter's private table. Oak. She'd had 48 hours to vacate the cabin. They took the mules. They took the timber tools. They took the wood stove. Oak. Sutter had let it be known through quiet channels that the widow Calloway still owed a balance on the manufactured debt, and that he was a patient man. Oak. She had run because the alternative was unthinkable. Oak. "Owen," Marguerite said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Come sit with your sister. Keep her warm." Oak. "There's something out there, Mama. Heavy. I can hear it breathing." Oak. Marguerite pulled the iron tent stake from the ground beside her, the only thing she had left that might pass as a weapon, and moved toward her son. She pressed him gently back from the flap and put her eye to the gap in the canvas. Oak. The night was absolute. The snow reflected a faint blue luminescence from the cloud-covered sky, just enough to see the black wall of cedar and Douglas fir pressing in on 3 sides. The wind had dropped for a moment, and in that sudden, terrible quiet, Marguerite heard what Owen had heard. A slow, deliberate crunch of something very large walking through crusted snow. A low exhale, steady and indifferent, that did not belong to any small creature. Oak. A black bear, not in hibernation, moving through the camp perimeter with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had not found what it was looking for yet. Oak. Marguerite pulled Owen behind her and raised the tent stake. Oak. The bear found the tent before she could form any kind of plan. It pressed its massive head against the canvas, sniffing along the seam, drawn by the scent of the children, of the remnants of food, of human warmth in the freezing dark. The fabric bowed inward. Rosalie stirred on the bedroll, her eyes opening without focus. Oak. Marguerite stepped fully in front of her children and drew herself up to every inch she had. Oak. The canvas tore. Oak. Cold and darkness and the enormous head of the bear came through the gap in the same instant. Marguerite screamed. not in panic, but in the way a person screams when they have nothing left to lose, and swung the iron stake with both hands directly at the animal's nose. Oak. She connected. The bear lurched backward with an indignant grunt of pain. Oak. And then a sound split the night that Marguerite did not recognize. Oak. It was not a gunshot. It was a short, percussive blast, something between a crack and a thunderclap, and it came from the tree line to the north. A second blast followed it. The bear wheeled away from the tent with a startled, almost petulant snort and crashed back into the cedars. Oak. Silence. Oak. Then footsteps. Long, unhurried, certain footsteps in the snow. Oak. A figure emerged from the dark tree line. He was taller than any man Marguerite had encountered outside of her memory, built like something the mountains had assembled, out of necessity rather than intention. Broad through the shoulders, wrapped in oilskin and heavy wool, a fur-lined trapper's hat pulled low against the cold. In one hand he carried a long-handled noise cracker, a bare deterrent tool made of compressed steel that discharged a startling blast of sound. Oak. In the other, a pine-pitch torch that threw long orange shadows across the snow. Oak. He stopped at the edge of the destroyed tent flap and looked at the tableau inside. The mother on her feet with an iron stake raised above her head, the boy pressed against the back canvas, the small girl on the bedroll, and he did not speak immediately. He looked the way a man looks when he is adding up a sum he didn't expect to find. Oak. The bear won't come back tonight, he said. His voice was low and deliberate, shaped by someone who had spent a great deal of time alone and had learned to use words carefully as a result. He wasn't hunting, he was curious. You gave him a reason to be less curious. Oak. Marguerite did not lower the stake. Who are you? Oak. Augustin Leclerc. He said it plainly, the way a man states a fact he has no particular feeling about. I trapped the upper Fraser line. My camp is about a mile northeast up the ridge. Solid walls. A stove. He looked at Rosalie. Even from the tent entrance, the pallor of the child was visible. That girl needs heat she isn't getting in here. Oak. I don't know you, Marguerite said. Oak. No, Augustin agreed, you don't. Oak. He didn't argue further. He didn't move. He stood in the freezing dark and waited, with a patience that did not feel like strategy. It felt like a man who understood that fear was reasonable, and that trust was something a person had to arrive at on their own. Oak. Marguerite looked at Rosalie. She looked at Owen, who had stopped gripping the fishing knife quite so hard and was watching the large man in the doorway with a child's uncomplicated assessment of whether something was dangerous. Oak. Owen looked back at his mother and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Oak. She dropped the tent stake. Oak. Augustin Leclerc, she said. My name is Marguerite Calloway. That is my daughter Rosalie and my son Owen. She straightened. If you are offering shelter, we accept. Oak. He nodded once and stepped aside. Oak. The hike up the ridge was the hardest thing Marguerite had done since the morning she had walked out of her own home with a flour sack in each hand and 2 children at her heels. The snow came to her thighs in places. Augustin broke the trail ahead of her, carrying Rosalie wrapped inside his oilskin coat with one arm, his torch in the other, moving with the methodical ease of a man who had crossed this ground 10,000 times. Oak. Owen walked behind Marguerite, gripping the back of her coat, his small face set with a determination that broke her heart every time she looked at it. Oak. She didn't look at it. Oak. She put her head down and walked. Oak. The camp appeared between 2 massive granite outcroppings, a low, heavy-built structure of hand-hewn spruce logs, roofed with split cedar shakes and sealed with packed earth along the seams. It was not beautiful. It was built by a man who understood the difference between comfort and survival, and had chosen survival as the foundation upon which everything else rested. Oak. But when Augustin swung the low door open, the wave of heat from the cast-iron stove inside hit Marguerite in the face like a physical thing, and she had to grip the door frame to keep her knees from giving out entirely. Oak. He settled Rosalie on a low bunk near the stove, wrapping her in a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar and campfire. He handed Owen a tin mug of hot broth, venison, dark and rich, and the boy drank it in long, desperate swallows without being told to slow down. Oak. Augustin set a second mug in front of Marguerite and then turned his back on the room to give them privacy, moving to the far end of the cabin to check the stove's damper and add wood. He was, she noticed, very careful about where he stood and which direction he faced. It was a thoughtfulness that people rarely have unless they have spent time learning why it matters. Oak. She has a chest infection, he said, his back still turned, listening to Rosalie's breathing. I can hear it from here. I have willow bark, dried yarrow. I'll make a compound tea. It won't fix her overnight, but it will bring the fever down. Oak. Marguerite wrapped both hands around the tin mug and stared at the steam rising from the broth. Why are you doing this, Mr. Leclerc? Oak. He was quiet for a moment. Because it is cold, and you have children. He said it as though the logic were self-evident. Is there another reason that's required? Oak. She shook her head. Oak. He brought her the broth and then knelt beside Rosalie's bunk, spooning the medicinal tea carefully between the child's cracked lips. There was no impatience in it. There was the same quality of attention she had seen him give to the trail, to the bear, to every aspect of this terrible night. The attention of a man who had learned long ago that carelessness in small things could become catastrophic in large ones. Oak. Mrs. Calloway, Augustin said, still focused on Rosalie. What is your family name before Calloway? Oak. She paused. Why? Oak. Because I found something on the old trail road 3 weeks ago, a leather-bound ledger, half buried under a windfall. He reached into the chest beside the bunk, drew out a slim, worn book, and held it out to her. Oak. Marguerite's breath left her body. Oak. She recognized the ledger before she touched it. She had watched Declan carry it in his breast pocket for 4 years. It was the one he used to record his timber assessments, his measurements, his correspondence. The one the sheriff's office claimed had never been found at the scene. Oak. She took it from Augustin's hands with fingers that had stopped feeling the cold entirely. Oak. Open to the last page, he said quietly. Oak. She did. Oak. Declan's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere. The careful, forward-leaning script of a man who had taught himself to write as an adult and took pride in each letter. Oak. They came for the survey maps. Sutter's men, 2 of them. I hid the real numbers in the binding nose. Tell Marguerite I am sorry I was not more careful. Tell her the land is worth fighting for. Tell her I... Oak. The sentence stopped mid-stroke, the pen dragging sideways across the page in a long, pale smear. Oak. Marguerite closed the book. She could not speak. She sat with it pressed flat against her chest until she had enough breath to use her voice again. Oak. He was killed, she said finally. It was not a question. Oak. Yes, Augustin said, I believe so. Oak. You believe so or you know so? Oak. He looked at her directly for the first time since they had entered the camp. His eyes were dark gray in the firelight, the color of the Fraser in late autumn, and they held the expression of a man who had decided some time ago that Naza was the only currency he could afford. Oak. I know so, he said. I found the ledger beside signs of a struggle. The windfall that covered it was not natural, branches cut, not broken. And the survey camp a half-mile away had been burned deliberately. You could see it in the burn pattern. The fire started from the outside in. Oak. Marguerite pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Oak. Sutter, she said. Oak. That name is written in the ledger 3 times, Augustin confirmed, each time with a figure beside it, large figures. Oak. The local constabulary in Cache Creek takes its direction from Sutter's office manager, Marguerite said, her voice hardening into something she hadn't known she possessed. The circuit judge was appointed with Sutter's recommendation. There is no one in the territory. Oak. There is a Dominion land agent in Kamloops, Augustin said. Federal jurisdiction. Sutter's influence does not reach that far. He paused. Not yet. Oak. Marguerite was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had shifted, dropping from a howl to a low, sustained moan. Inside the cabin, Rosalie's breathing had begun almost imperceptibly to ease. Owen had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall, his father's fishing knife still in his lap. Oak. You've been out here long, she asked. Oak. 11 years. Oak. Alone? Oak. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, I had a partner once, when I first came north, a good man. We held a joint timber license together on the Similkameen. He turned the tin mug in his large hands. Sutter's father ran the land consolidation operation in the southern interior before Sutter took it over. He used different methods than the son, faster ones. His jaw tightened. My partner did not survive the renegotiation of our license. Oak. Marguerite went still. Oak. I spent 3 years in the southern courts, Augustin continued, his voice flat. And even the way a man speaks about something he has carried so long it has worn smooth. The courts that Sutter Sr. had purchased. When I understood that the law was not going to help me, I handled things as a man handles things when there is no other option. And when I was finished, I came up here because I was no longer fit for the kind of company decent people keep." He looked up at her. Or so I believed. "Oak." Marguerite reached across the small table and placed her hand over his. It was an instinctive gesture, the kind that arrives before the mind can argue against it. "Oak. Your partner," she said. "What was his name?" "Oak. Samuel Hebert." He said it carefully. The way you say a name you do not say aloud very often because it still costs something. He had a wife in Penticton, 2 daughters. I made sure they received what was owed to them before I came north. "Oak. That is not the act of a man unfit for decent company," Marguerite said. "Oak." Augustin looked at her hand on his and did not pull away. "Oak. You have been alone long enough," she said. "Oak. Perhaps," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. "Oak." And then the cabin's silence cracked. "Oak." Not from outside, from above. "Oak." Owen was on his feet before either of them could move. "Mr. Leclerc," the boy said, his voice very careful. "The horses came back. I heard them stop." "Oak." Augustin was across the room before Owen finished the sentence. He pressed himself against the wall beside the shuttered window and put his eye to the narrow gap between the shutter and the frame. "Oak." Marguerite went to the children without being told. She positioned herself between them and the door. "Oak. How many?" she asked. "Oak. 4 riders." His voice had gone completely neutral, stopping at the tree line, waiting. He stepped back from the window, reached above the door frame, and took down a long-barreled rifle. He checked the breech with the automatic efficiency of long practice. "They tracked us up the ridge. The snow betrayed us." "Oak." "Sutter?" "Oak." "His men." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "There's a root cellar under the floor. Behind the stove the boards lift. Take the children." "Oak." Marguerite caught his arm as he turned toward the door. "What are you going to do?" "Oak." Augustin looked at her for a moment with those gray Fraser River eyes, and something in them had shifted. Not cold, not angry, but settled. Like a man who has finally located something he lost a long time ago and is not prepared to lose it again. "Oak." "I am going to remind them," he said, "that they are a very long way from their jurisdiction." "Oak." She held his gaze for one more second, then let go. "Oak." She threw back the boards behind the stove. The root cellar below was dark and cold, and smelled of earth and dried spruce root. She helped Owen down first, then lowered herself with Rosalie held against her chest. "Oak." "Owen," she whispered in the dark, "hold your sister, do not make a sound." "Oak." "Yes, Mama." His voice was almost unbearably steady for an 8-year-old boy. "Oak." She pressed her lips to both their foreheads in the dark, then climbed back up, eased the boards into place, and went to find a position along the cabin's stone fireplace where the wall was thickest. "Oak." From outside a voice came through the timber, broad, aggrieved, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Oak." "Leclerc, we know you're in there. We know the Calloway woman is with you. Send her out with the ledger and we'll have no quarrel with you. Whatever she's told you about Mr. Sutter is the confused grief of a widow who doesn't understand her husband's business dealings." "Oak." Augustin did not answer. He moved to the gun slit beside the door and settled the rifle against his shoulder. "Oak." "Last chance, Leclerc. We have 4 men, and we are not going back to Kamloops empty-handed." "Oak." What happened next took 45 seconds and rearranged the geography of the confrontation entirely. "Oak." The first shot from Augustin's rifle took the lead rider's hat cleanly off his head and deposited it in the snow 12 feet behind him. The rider threw himself sideways off his horse with a yell that echoed up the canyon walls. The horse bolted. "Oak." The return fire came fast and wild. Men shooting from horseback in the dark at a log wall, which is to say the logs absorbed it, and Augustin did not. He moved from slit to slit with the unhurried discipline of someone who had been in worse positions and had learned to keep his breathing even. "Oak." One of the riders tried to flank the cabin to the north. A second crack from Augustin's rifle sent him scrambling back into the tree line. "Oak." Then from the south side of the camp, Marguerite smelled it. "Oak." Kerosene. "Oak." She understood what it meant a half-second before the orange glow began spreading across the cedar shake roof above the stovepipe. "Oak." Augustin. Her voice was flat and clear, the roof. "Oak." He turned from the gun slit. He looked up at the spreading light on the ceiling. And Marguerite watched his face do something she had not expected. She watched it go still and empty, the way a man's face goes when he is suddenly standing in 2 places at once, 11 years apart, and the second place is on fire. "Oak." She crossed the cabin in 4 steps. "Oak." She put both hands on his chest and looked straight up into his face. Oak. Augustin Leclerc, she said, you are not losing anyone to a fire tonight. Look at me. Oak. His eyes, which had gone somewhere far away, came back to her. They focused on her face with the abruptness of a door opening. Oak. The children, he said. Oak. I know, go. Oak. He moved. Oak. He drove the iron pry bar between two of the lower logs at the back wall, behind the stone chimney, which was the only part of the cabin that could not burn, and applied a force to them that should not have been possible for a single man. The logs shifted. Behind them, Marguerite saw darkness and felt cold air moving, carrying the smell of deep earth and old stone. Oak. There is an old mine access, he said, pulling the logs fully aside. It was here when I built around it. 60 yards, then it opens onto the eastern face of the ridge. Oak. He got the children up from the cellar, while Marguerite soaked 2 wool blankets in the water barrel and threw them over the small group. Above them, the roof was beginning to sing with heat. Oak. They went into the dark one by one. Oak. Rosalie, still feverish but breathing, wrapped inside Augustine's coat. Owen, silent and ferocious, holding his mother's hand. Marguerite, Augustine last, pulling the logs back into place behind them as the first burning rafter came down somewhere in the cabin, with a sound like a large animal falling. Oak. The tunnel was narrow and smelled of ancient glacial stone. Augustine lit a single match and cupped it with his huge, scarred hand. They moved in silence, the roar of the fire shrinking behind the rock until it was no more than a vibration in the soles of their feet. Oak. The shaft opened behind a curtain of frozen deadfall on the eastern ridge. They emerged into the bitter pre-dawn air and crouched in the tree line, looking back over the ridge at the orange column of light that had been Augustin Leclerc's home for 11 years. Oak. He looked at it for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His eyes were dry. Oak. Then he turned away from it. Oak. Stay here, he said to Marguerite. Keep them low and quiet. Oak. You don't have the rifle, she said. Oak. No, he agreed. Oak. Then what? Oak. The men who did this are gathered around the fire to stay warm, he said. They believe we are in it. They will wait for it to burn down so they can look for the ledger. They are cold, they are off their horses, and they are not watching the tree line. He looked at her with those quiet, certain eyes. I am going to suggest to them that they revisit their contractual obligations to Reginald Sutter. Oak. He was gone before she could argue. Oak. What occurred on the other side of the ridge, Marguerite reconstructed afterward from what she heard and what Augustin told her, partly later when she could get him to talk about it. Oak. 3 of Sutter's men were standing around the burning ruin when Augustin came out of the dark tree line above them. He did not announce himself. He did not fire a warning shot. He came down the slope in the dark with the particular silence of a man who has spent a decade learning to move through this specific forest. And the first indication Sutter's men had that they were not alone was when the largest of the 3 simply ceased to be standing. Oak. The second man ran. Oak. The third, the one who had given orders from outside the cabin, a hard-faced contractor named by the others as Bellinger, spun and found himself looking up at Augustin Leclerc from a distance of approximately 4 feet, which was not a comfortable distance to find oneself from Augustin Leclerc. Oak. The ledger, Bellinger said, his voice working hard to stay even. Sutter just wants. Oak. Sutter, Augustin said, is going to receive a visitor from the Dominion Land Office in Kamloops within the fortnight. A visitor who will have access to a ledger that documents, in Reginald Sutter's own handwriting and the handwriting of a dead man, the full history of his operations in this district. He reached down and took Bellinger's revolver out of its holster with the calm efficiency of someone removing a tool from a workbench. You are going to ride back to Kamloops. Oak. You are going to find the telegraph office. And you are going to send a message to the regional superintendent of the Dominion Lands Branch telling him that an affidavit pertaining to the fraudulent land seizure of one Declan Calloway is available for collection in Lillooet. He pressed the revolver barrel very gently to the center of Bellinger's sternum. Oak. And then you are going to tell Reginald Sutter that the ledger of his sins has found its way to people who have nothing left to lose and every reason to use it. Do you understand me? Oak. Bellinger understood him. Oak. The sky above the Fraser Canyon was turning from black to a deep, bruised violet when Augustin came back through the tree line. Marguerite stood up from the deadfall where she had been keeping the children still and warm and looked at him. He was walking slowly. He had a long cut above one eyebrow that he had not mentioned, and was bleeding quietly down the side of his face. She didn't comment on it. She simply took the folded bandage cloth from her coat pocket. She had been carrying it since the second week on the trail, because she was the kind of person who carried bandage cloth, and pressed it firmly to the cut. Done? She asked. Done, he said. They stood like that for a moment, her hand at his temple, the first pale light coming over the peaks. The ledger, she said. Declan said the map was in the binding. He said the binding knows. Augustin was quiet. Then may I? She handed him the book. He turned it in the early light, running his thumb along the spine, the way a man runs his thumb along a seam he suspects is not what it appears to be. He took the small folding knife from his belt and, with a surgeon's precision, separated the stitching of the leather spine from the board beneath. The folded paper inside was no larger than a letter. He unfolded it carefully. It was a survey map. Declan's hand, drafted meticulously, with figures written in the margins and the compact notation of a man who understood what he was looking at. Timber stands, crown land boundaries. And at the center of the map, circled twice in dark ink, a section notation that corresponded to a stand of old-growth Douglas fir on the upper Chilcotin bench. Timber that Marguerite, even with her limited knowledge of the industry, understood was worth more than everything Sutter had taken from her family combined. Declan had known. He had known what he had found, and he had known what it would cost him, and he had hidden the record of it in the only place he could think of before they came for him. Marguerite pressed her hand flat over the map for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside her coat, close to her chest. We get to Lillooet, she said. Yes, Augustin agreed. And then the Dominion Land Office in Kamloops. Yes. And you're coming with us, she said. It was not quite a question. Augustin looked at the column of smoke, still rising above the ridge where his camp had been, and then he looked at Marguerite Calloway in the early morning light. This woman who had swung an iron stake at a bear rather than surrender, who had slapped him back from 11 years of ghosts with both hands, who had held a bandage cloth to his face in the cold as though it were the most natural thing she had ever done. And something in the locked, solitary architecture of his face quietly came apart. I have nothing left up here, he said. Not anymore. Then you have nothing keeping you from somewhere better, she said. The journey to Lillooet took 4 days. Augustin knew the terrain the way a person knows the lines of their own hands, and he kept them moving at a pace that was punishing but survivable. Rosalie's fever broke on the second morning, and by the 4th day the girl was walking on her own and asking with increasing frequency how much farther. A question that Marguerite considered the most welcome sound she had heard in months. What followed was neither swift nor simple. Because justice rarely is, and because Reginald Sutter was a man with considerable resources and a strong incentive to deploy them. But the Dominion Land Office in Kamloops was federal, as Augustin had said, and its regional superintendent was a man named Greaves, who had been looking for a reason to audit Sutter's operations for 2 years and received the Calloway ledger like a long-awaited gift. The full accounting took 9 months. Sutter was arrested in the spring, charged under the Dominion Lands Act, with fraudulent claims, coercion, and conspiracy to obstruct Crown land proceedings. Bellinger, who had received the kind of persuasion that makes a man reconsider his loyalties, provided a deposition that ran to 11 pages. The charges in connection with Declan Calloway's death were harder to prove and took longer, but they came. The timber rights documented in Declan's survey map were filed in Marguerite Calloway's name in June. She did not sell them immediately. She sat with the fact of them for a long time the way a person sits with something they have carried far too long as a wound and must learn to carry differently as a resource. In the summer, she bought a property at the edge of Lillooet's lower bench. A wide, low house, with a covered porch facing the river, and enough pasture for the 2 horses she acquired, and a kitchen garden that Owen immediately claimed as his own project with a seriousness that made the neighbors smile. Augustine Leclerc did not return to the Upper Fraser line. He spent 2 weeks in Lillooet helping to repair the fence lines on the new property, because the fence lines needed repair, and because he was a man who found it easier to stay in motion than to articulate the reasons he was staying. Ok. He built a small workshop at the back of the property out of salvaged lumber, because there was always something that needed building or fixing, and because working with his hands in a place that was becoming familiar to him felt increasingly like the opposite of loneliness. Ok. On an evening in late August, when the light over the canyon had gone gold and the kids were asleep, and the river was making its quiet, continuous argument with the rocks below the bench, Marguerite brought 2 cups of coffee to the porch and sat down in the second chair. Ok. Augustin sat in the first one. Ok. He had found, over the past months, that he was good at sitting quietly with Marguerite Calloway. He was good at it in the same way that he was good at understanding weather and reading terrain. Not because he had been taught, but because he had paid close attention. Ok. Owen asked me this morning, Marguerite said, whether you were going to stay. Ok. Augustin wrapped both hands around the mug. What did you tell him? Ok. I told him I didn't know. She looked at him. I told him I thought you might, if someone thought to ask you properly. Ok. The river moved below them. A nighthawk called from somewhere over the water. Ok. I lost my way for a long time, Augustin said. I thought it was the mountains that put me right. It turned out to be different from what I expected. Ok. What was it? Ok. He set his coffee down and turned to look at her. This woman who had run 43 miles through a January blizzard with her children and a flour sack and had not once considered stopping. Who had held an iron stake against a bear. Who had put her hands on his chest in a burning cabin and called him back from the longest night of his life. Ok. An iron stake, he said. Ok. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that arrives when something has been terrible for a very long time and has finally, unmistakably, turned into something else. Ok. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his, carefully, the way a man handles something that matters more than he knows how to say. Ok. Above the Fraser Canyon, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, cold and certain, and very far from the longest winter either of them had ever survived. Ok. They sat together until the coffee was cold and the night was full, and neither of them felt any particular need to be anywhere else. Ok. I keep thinking about that moment when Marguerite raised an iron stake against a bear in the dark. No weapon, no plan, no one coming to help, and did it anyway. Not because she was fearless, because she was a mother, and there was simply no other option she was willing to consider. Ok. That's the thing about real courage. It doesn't arrive wearing armor. It arrives when you're exhausted and terrified, and you do the next necessary thing regardless. Ok. What struck me most about Marguerite's story is the chain of consequences that runs through it, the quiet, inexorable way that every choice produces the next reality. Reginald Sutter believed that taking everything from a widow and her children was the end of the matter. He had the law, the ledger, the land. What he didn't account for was what happens to a person when you strip away everything except their character. Ok. Marguerite had nothing left to lose, and that turned out to be the most dangerous thing in the Fraser Canyon that winter. Ok. Declan had understood something too, in those final desperate minutes. He didn't spend them on anger or regret. He spent them on a careful, practical act, hiding the map where it might survive him, where it might still reach his family, even after he couldn't. That kind of clarity under pressure isn't luck. It's what happens when a person has spent years developing the discipline to think past their own fear. Ok. His mind was the one thing no one could take from him, and he used it until the very last moment. Ok. I think about Augustin Leclerc too, and how long he had been gone from the world before that January night. 11 years is a long time to carry grief like a set of instructions. He had let it tell him who he was. Someone unfit for people, for connection, for the kind of life that requires you to be present and vulnerable on a daily basis. And then Marguerite put her hands on his chest in a burning cabin and called him back, and the thing that broke him open wasn't her strength exactly. Ok. It was her refusal to leave him behind. Ok. There's a consequence to decency that people underestimate. Sutter built his empire on the assumption that cruelty was efficient, that fear was a reliable tool, that ordinary people could be ground down until they stopped mattering. What he built instead was a ledger of cause and effect that eventually reached the Dominion Land Office in Kamloops and ended his career in handcuffs. Ok. Every act of harm he committed left a record somewhere, in a blood-smeared journal, in a man's scarred memory, in a woman who refused to stop walking south through 4 feet of snow. Ok. What I take from this story is something I find myself returning to often. The people who survive the worst winters aren't always the strongest or the most resourceful in any obvious sense. They're the ones who refuse to become what was done to them. Marguerite didn't become someone who trusted no one. Augustin didn't stay someone who helped no one. They chose, each of them, against the easier and more understandable path. And that choice, made quietly and without any guarantee of outcome, was the thing that changed everything. I don't think that's coincidence. I think that's just how it works.